things that change supply. I present this lecture after I've already gone through and presented a supply schedule where we'll say at 20 cents, you know, Coca-Cola might want to sell 6 million, and $1.50 they might want to sell 100 million 2-liter bottles, and at $5 they might be willing to sell 2 billion. In other words, as the prices go up, the quantity that suppliers are willing to offer also goes up. And so it is a positive relationship, and that graphs in an upward, as you go left to right, it graphs in an upward manner. The thing is, it's just like demand. And do you remember demand, of course, was the only main difference was that it was an inverse relationship and it graphed in a downward slope going left to right. But the thing is that that's just the same, is that price does not. It does not change supply. It changes the quantity supplied. So in other words, when the price changes, you like 0.2 goes to 1.5, then you just, as you shift from one to the other, you shift in quantity. But the graph, which represents all of the possible price and quantity supplies combinations, the graph doesn't shift the line does not shift. When we graph a function, something, let's say we had a function 3x equals y. You punch in an x and you get a y value, right? Well, that's the way it is with the supply curve. There's a supply function. And when we get to intermediate, we'll start having algebra, basically, where we'll have an equation for supply and an equation for demand. And so if you start thinking that there's actually an equation for supply, a function, and that the graph is simply a picture of the function, just like a graph of any xy function. So something that's part of the function can't change the function. So price is a part of the supply function. Once you have a value of price, and then that gives you the value of quantity. Since price is a part of the function, it can't change the function. It's part of the function. So a new curve would have to be drawn for there to be a new supply curve. So in other words, the function has to actually change, and there's things that can do it, but not price. Okay? Now, before I move to a new page and start listing these out, we need to understand that an increase is a move to the right to greater quantity. So at all prices, all the different points would move from the original curve to, I hope I'm not covering up the microphones. No, I don't think I am. Would move to higher quantities. So just pick any price, arbitrarily, price X, okay? At this price, originally it had a quantity like here, right? Down here, quantity X. But now, because there's been a change, there's a new quantity X, quantity X1, let's say. And it's farther to the right, which means at that price, they're willing to supply a larger quantity than before. And at any price, arbitrarily, that you could pick anywhere, it will match up after the change. If you've moved this direction, at a higher quantity supplied. So moving to the right is an increase in supply. Moving to the left is a decrease. And this is just messy. I know by now you realize I'm drawing this on an iPad with my index finger. I've not had much luck getting any more accuracy in my drawing when I use the little pen that's supposed to work on the iPad. But anyway, finger works just as good. And so it's messy either way, but I don't have a lot of space here, so when we move to the left, that's a decrease, and I'm just going to write D, okay? Maybe I can get decrease, okay? So moving to the left is a decrease, moving to the right is an increase. Got it? All right, now let's figure out what changes these things. How about technology? Technology is one of the items. It usually moves supply to the right. It has some exceptions. And here's the reason, first of all. Here's the reason. If you're going to have, if you're going to produce something, and that's supposed to be an O, that's not technology, that's supposed to be an O. Isn't that beautiful? Okay. Here's the thing. In a free market system, if someone produces technology, they have to be able to sell it to somebody. And manufacturers have a choice whether to buy it. So, I mean, if I go up to your factory and you're a factory owner and I say, buy my $200 million assembly line system, I guarantee you it will triple your costs. Think about it. I'm going to have to be better than the slickest salesperson to sell you something that'll make it more expensive to do business, and you have to pay for the $200 million for my equipment, right? So you're not going to buy it unless it cuts your costs, unless it pays for itself and gives you something extra. So technology usually moves supply to the right because it makes it more efficient to produce things, and therefore profits go up, costs go down, we get more efficient. Okay, there are some things that are exceptions. That's why I wrote the word usually. For example, defense. The goal of purchasing new fighter jets and bombs and missiles is not to save costs, right? It's not to cut costs for the private sector. It's to destroy things more efficiently or to protect the lives of pilots by, switching to drones instead of fighter planes with pilots, things like that. So they have other goals, and so costs can go up tremendously. $1 million a missile or something. They can go up tremendously because their goal isn't to cut costs, and they will be purchased whether the costs go up or not. So I'd say that's definitely an exception. And what about medicine? Isn't medical technology, isn't that something that the goal is not to be cheap, not to cut costs? The goal is to save lives or to save pain or detect cancer or whatever more efficiently. So technology in medicine also does not have a goal. Hospitals, they don't have the goal of cutting costs. Hospitals usually don't buy equipment because it'll make the medicine cheaper. They usually buy it because it will help them detect cancer or cure cancer or something. That's the real goal. And so medicine is also one where sometimes it shifts the supply curve to the left. And I had a student tell me once he thought education might be the same way. And I'm still debating that, so I wouldn't require you to know that third one about education. But it's something to think about. But anyway, technology in the free markets usually moves supply to the right. So if there's a new method of producing something and a company buys it, they probably bought it because it's more efficient and supply moves to the right. Okay, what else? These are things from the first page where the title says, what shifts supply? How about cost of resources or cost of inputs? That could be everything from raw materials to labor, electricity to, run the equipment, fuel, even things like transportation, cost of inputs, the cost of diesel, if it gets really expensive, can affect the supply of a lot of things because they have to basically at all prices they can produce less, they can provide less quantity at all prices, right? And if diesel gets cheaper, it gets cheaper to move things and deliver things. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what do I mean by the cost of inputs? The main thing is, if the costs go up, okay, here you've got your supply. Supply isn't jagged, my finger's jagged. Okay, here we go. So if you got supply here, price, quantity, this would be a decrease in cost of inputs. Okay, and this way would be an increase in the cost of inputs. In fact, I think I can probably draw it differently. Let's see if we do this. If I say supply moves this way when inputs are cheaper, and this way when inputs are more expensive. Boy, there's just not room for this. But you saw me writing it, so if you paid attention, that makes sense, even though it looks ugly now. Okay, so basically, let's say that the union, let's say you're an automobile manufacturing plant, or you manage an automobile manufacturing plant, and when the union negotiates with you, they get an incredible pay raise. So all the union members are happy, but what happens to the supply of automobiles that you produce? If the union got the increased contract, then the labor is more expensive. So we should expect that supply would move to the left. Okay? Oh, and that would work for McDonald's too, wouldn't it? If McDonald's has to pay $15 an hour to its basic employee, they're going to be, at all prices, they're going to be able to provide less burgers. Okay, let's see. Besides the cost of inputs, what about the prices of other goods in production? So these would be related goods. So instead of other, I could say of related goods. So you could put the word related. And then what that means is, if it's easy for your factory or your business to switch over to something else from what you're producing now. For example, dairy farmers can produce beef. It's not the best tasting beef, but they can have their dairy cows slaughtered, right? So they can go, dairy farmers can go from selling milk and cream, right? So they can go from selling that to selling beef. And so if beef prices are really high, we might find that dairy farmers will say, well, I might as well slaughter old Bessie here because I can get a lot of money for her right now. And I make more money off of that than I will off of the milk. So the price of the beef could affect the supply of dairy if dairy cattle are being slaughtered, right? Because then there wouldn't be as much dairy, and that price would change. So we're not talking about as in demand where a related good was like a substitute or a complement. What we're talking about here is something that could be produced like an oil refinery can make heating oil, or they can make gasoline, or they can make diesel, or they can make jet fuel. And so the price of one of them, if one of them becomes suddenly profitable, they can just retool that refinery really quickly and start producing jet fuel instead of heating oil. And if they're not producing heating oil, then the supply of heating oil is affected by the price of jet fuel. Got it? Okay. How about the number of suppliers? This is kind of a duh. If we have, let's say that we have some students that are weaving some beautiful sort of scarves and shawls. And so we have 2 students, and they're spending their time in the dorm or sitting out on the quad, and they're weaving these beautiful things. And in the course of a school year, between the 2 of them, they can produce 10. And someone else says, my goodness, you're making good money selling these, for Christmas presents and birthday presents and stuff. I'm going to join in. Well, the minute a third person joins in and they can make 5 of them a year, now we have 15 that can be produced in a year. So basically, more suppliers move supply to the right towards more quantity. So more moves supply to the right, right? Got it? What else? Expectations. Do you remember we talked about expected price changes? Like if I announced that the price of gasoline is going to be $10 a gallon tomorrow, would it affect how much gasoline you buy today? Yes. So it actually would shift not just the quantity, but it would shift the whole curve. If you expected a change tomorrow, tomorrow's price is not a part of the function, the supply function. And I was talking about demand earlier, right? Well, it's the same over here with the supply function. Expectations, if GM says to themselves, we expect that the price of gasoline is going to be really expensive, and therefore the demand for our big monster suburban SUVs is going to be down next year. Will that affect how many Suburbans they produce this year? It should, because they're producing this year for next year's. I mean, they're already starting to produce these models for the rollout date, right? And if we think, oh, next year people aren't going to be buying them because gas is going to be expensive. So expectations for the future, costs and demands, those things affect supply as well. Okay? Now this this particular topic of what changes supply is through, but the video is going to continue because I'm going to take us to how we find prices now, because now I taught you in a previous lecture about demand, and then we learned about supply in this lecture. And so now we can put them together, and that's how we find out what the price is, because the buyers and the sellers disagree everywhere except in one spot. For example, if we pick a price that is not here, so this is going to be what we call equilibrium. The equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity will be where they cross. So that point they cross, what just happened here? Oh, that's nice. That point where they cross is going to be equilibrium. And the price that matches it is the equilibrium price. And the quantity that matches up with that is equilibrium quantity. And so at that point, they're going to agree. But let's pick a non-equilibrium. Let's pick a price that's too high. So I'm just going to call it pH. See, we graph so easy in economics in these lower level classes because we're not even using real numbers. We're using price high, price equilibrium, price low. So we're really looking at the direction of changes. It's really not that bad for understanding. It's not even as difficult as a math class where you're graphing with real numbers, right? Here it's like cartoon graphs. We're graphing with relative numbers. This price here is relatively higher than this price here. So let's start with price high, and notice that the demanders at a high price are going to choose quantity that's rather a low quantity, right? And how do I know that's the demanders? Because I went to the demand curve. See, D for demand. Okay, so you to find out what the demanders want to do, you start with the price, you go over to the demand curve, you go down, and that's the quantity that people would buy. But the suppliers don't think that way. At a high price, they want to produce a high quantity, right? So your quantity supplied is way over here. So let me get rid of that equilibrium quantity for now. What we have is quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied. So the price, when it's higher than the equilibrium, is going to produce, what do you call it? When the amount people want to buy is less than the amount people want to supply, you have a surplus. You have a surplus. And vice versa, if the price is below equilibrium, then when you cut across, the first thing you notice is that the quantity on the, now I'm going to get rid of these quantities. And I think I'm going to change the color of the pen just to help see the differences. Okay? And that'll help some of you. You go across and you go to this quantity, you go to the supply curve, and that gives you the quantity supplied. And at the same low price, you go over to the demand curve and down to find the quantity demanded. And so at a low price, or any price lower than the equilibrium price, now we've got to where the quantity supplied is less, oops, my hand jerked, that's lovely, is less than the quantity demanded. What do you call that? That gap is a shortage, isn't it? You see it? Okay, so basically when you have a shortage, you tend to have people bidding up the price. Believe me, if we're short on something, there's going to be someone that is willing to pay more, and the price is bid up. If the price gets too high, like I said, overshoots equilibrium, then at a high price we have a surplus, right? And even just a penny too high, we have a surplus. We have too much. And when you have a surplus, you tend to have downward pressure, sales. There's too much of something, it's going to be, the price is going to be cut. And so what you have is a very stable position where the forces from below, if the price is too low, it's being pushed up. And if the price is too high, it's being pushed down. That is a mess. So let me see if I can clean it up a tad and give you a general idea. Let's see, here's the axis again. Here's equilibrium. This is where the price should be, but the price is being driven upward if it's anywhere below. Okay? The price is being driven downward if it's anywhere above, and these forces are pushing. Basically, that price will be slammed to the equilibrium price. I mean, you've got forces from below pushing up, forces from above pushing down. The price is stable. And that's what the term equilibrium tends to mean. It means a point of rest, of stability. So, and it's also the only part where the quantity demanded and quantity supplied is the same. It's the only place where they will agree. So, getting rid of those, at equilibrium, this is the quantity demanded and supplied. So I'm going to put an S on one side and a D on the other, because it's the same quantity. And so we often call this the market clearing price or the clearing price. Market clearing. What does that mean? It means that at that price, the market produces just the amount that people want to buy. There's no surplus, there's no shortage, and that's one of the criticisms of socialism, communism, where you have a central planning unit that plans out everything. They don't get the market actually finds the right price on its own because these laws work. You'll end up with a price, and that price will not have a surplus and not have a shortage. It will be a price where the market clears. Okay? But in central planning, when they set prices, some committee sets a price, the odds are they're not setting the equilibrium price, and the market will still tend to want to produce either a surplus or a shortage because it isn't an equilibrium price. And that's why, and often politicians set low prices where, the equilibrium price of bread may be $3, but they say, oh, well, that's not good for poor people. Let's set the equilibrium price of bread at 10 cents. And so the price is too low, and that gives you a shortage. If the price is 10 cents and the equilibrium is $3, then the price is too low, and you end up with a shortage of bread. And so did you help anybody? If people can't get bread, making it cheap doesn't help. And that does lead us to talk about things like rent controls, where the government jumps in and sets a price, and it's not equilibrium price. Or minimum wage. It's not equilibrium. And so you can end up with surplus of workers with a minimum wage. You can end up with shortage of quantity and quality in rent controls. And these are all situations where a price was arbitrarily set that was not necessarily it's not going to be equilibrium. The market's not going to clear. And so when the government makes a law, though, and says you can't pay someone less than $15 an hour, if that price is too high, you could end up with a surplus of workers or unemployment. So did you help people? If you had a job, you could make $15 an hour, but guess what? You don't get a job. Okay, so we can talk about this in class when I have a board that I can write on a little more neatly. My hands wobble, and on the large board, it's not as apparent as on this little one. So, anyway, we'll stop this lecture and I'll start another one. And I'll see you in class.